In this video, we expose every corrupted police officer's sentenced to life in prison, from the first haunted cases to the ones in 2025, the men who instead abused power, betrayed trust, and committed serious crimes, even murder. Before we begin, let us know where did you find this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Michael Val, 1975, age 50, Island, New York. Michael Val, born in 1975, is a former police officer with the New York Police Department, NYPD. Before his crimes, Valva had served 17 years in the police force. He is a divorced father of 3 sons, including 8-year-old Thomas Valva, the victim of the case. Valva lives with his girlfriend, Angela Pina, and her 3 daughters. Although he was considered a skilled police officer, Valva's career was ruined by his brutal criminal behavior. Val's actions not only destroyed his family, but also destroyed the trust in those responsible for protecting the community. On a cold winter night in January 2020, a 911 call from Michael Valva shocked everyone. He said that his son, Thomas, had fallen and was unconscious. But what really happened behind those words? Thomas Valva, an 8-year-old boy, was not just the victim of an accident, but the victim of horrific abuse, left in the cold without any help. Thomas' story shocked the community and raised big questions about how a man could turn into such a cruel villain. Michael Valva, a former NYPD officer, was seen by society as a protector of the law. However, when details of his family life were revealed, everyone began to doubt Valva's true character. Living in a house with 3 children, Valva and his girlfriend Angela Pina began a life full of turmoil. Both Valva and Pina engaged in abusive behavior toward their children, especially toward 2 children diagnosed with autism, Thomas and his older brother, Anthony. According to investigative reports, before the incident, Thomas and Anthony lived in an unheated garage without basic needs of a child, such as a bed and blankets. Security camera videos in the house revealed Valva's brutal treatment of his children, especially Thomas. Not only was the boy left out in the cold, but he also suffered terrible punishments from his father. The image of a father who would be so cruel as to abandon his child in the middle of a cold night and then call 911 just to cover up his crime is infuriating. Thomas Valva endured the unimaginable. It was more than just the death of a child. It was an event that deeply shook anyone who heard it. When the authorities got involved and analyzed the evidence, they confirmed that Michael Valva's actions were not random, but a series of cruel acts, motivated by nothing but indifference and hatred. The death of Thomas Valva is more than a family tragedy. It is a warning to society about the abuse of power and responsibility. A man, a former police officer, could abuse his power to harm the innocent children he was supposed to protect. This case is a clear illustration of a painful truth. Not all men in uniform are worthy of the community's trust and respect. After the truth about Michael Valva's actions was revealed, justice came to him. In December 2022, Valva was convicted of second-degree murder and multiple counts of child abuse. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and could have to serve the rest of his life. This shows that no one, no matter who they are, can escape punishment if they commit crimes. The recognition of justice in this case is not only a comfort to Thomas' family, but also an important lesson for those who disregard the safety and care of children. Communities and authorities must do more to protect the rights of children and bring abusers to light, so that stories like Thomas Valva's do not happen again. The Michael Valva case has unleashed a wave of outrage and grief among those who witnessed this brutality. The abuse of power and the cold-bloodedness of a father not only took the life of an innocent child, but also left an entire community in pain. But while crimes may remain hidden for a time, justice will eventually find its perpetrator. In this case, Michael Valva has paid the price for his actions, and child safety will continue to be a key issue in discussions about protecting children's rights in society. Daniel Holtzclaw, 1986, age 39, state Oklahoma. Daniel Holtzclaw, born in 1986, is a police officer who served with the Oklahoma City Police Department. Before his arrest and conviction, Holtzclaw had a clean image, described as honest and responsible in his work. However, behind the uniform and the officer's status, Holtzclaw used his power to abuse and sexually assault at least 13 women in his service area. His victims were all vulnerable women, some of whom had criminal records or were using stimulants. Holtzclaw was sentenced to 263 years in prison for these crimes. When Daniel Holtzclaw was hired by the Oklahoma City Police Department, he seemed like a promising police officer, someone who would protect and serve the community. But what happened during Holtzclaw's tenure is a haunting and terrifying story. Taking advantage of his position and power, Holtzclaw became a predator, attacking and abusing many women in the area he was assigned to protect. Holtzclaw's story is not just a personal crime, but a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the responsibilities of law enforcement. Daniel Holtzclaw, a police officer with a spotless record, became one of the most iconic examples of abuse of power in the police force. As his case began to unfold, the community was shocked and in disbelief that a police officer could be a serial sex offender. Holtzclaw's victims were mostly hazardous women, many with criminal records, some with addiction problems. Holtzclaw uses his power and position to assault his victims, tricking them into false tests, then forcing them to perform sexual acts against their will, often threatening them with arrest or harm if they resist. According to reports, Holtzclaw picked easy victims, those he believed would not come forward. He worked in a predominantly black and minority area, and many of his victims were reluctant to come forward to the police. This makes them Holtzclaw's targets. The case also illustrates the lack of oversight of police officers. When Daniel Holtzclaw's case came to trial, the seriousness of these acts could not be ignored by the community and the legal system. The community cried out for justice, and in December 2015, Holtzclaw was sentenced to 263 years in prison on the 18 counts including sexual assault and criminal abuse of power. He will spend the rest of his life in prison, with no chance of parole. The story of Daniel Holtzclaw is a reminder of the importance of controlling and supervising law enforcement, especially those with power like police. Justice was not only sought for victims, but also an important lesson in protecting the community from abuse of power. Despite being a police officer, Holtzclaw did not escape the punishment his crimes deserved. This case will forever be a milestone in the fight against the crime. Daniel Holtzclaw abused his power to become a serial sex offender, destroying the community's trust in the police force. His actions were not only a personal crime, but also a warning about the dangers posed by those charged with upholding the law. Fortunately, justice was served, and Holtzclaw paid the price for his crimes. This story will forever be an important lesson about oversight, accountability, and justice in the legal system. Bobby Cutts Jar, 1981, age 44, Ohio. Bobby Cutts Jr., born in 1981, is a former police officer in Lake Township, Ohio. Before his crimes, Cutts was a seemingly normal man, a law enforcement officer with a thriving career. However, after killing his girlfriend, Jessie Marie Davis, and her unborn child, Cutts became a feared criminal. At the time, Cutts was in a relationship with Davis and was the father of the unborn child. After committing the brutal murder, Cutts tried to hide his actions, but eventually the truth about the murder was revealed, and he was sentenced to life in prison. One night in June 2007, A brutal crime occurred in Lake Township, Ohio, when Bobby Cutts Jr., a police officer, murdered his girlfriend, Jessie Marie Davis, and her unborn child. The deaths of mother and child shocked the community, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because the perpetrator was someone the community once trusted, a police officer. Although considered a stable career man, Cutts was a cold-blooded criminal who not only ended Davis's life, but also attempted to cover up his crime with a false story. Bobby Cutts Jr. appeared to be a fairly normal person before the incident. As a police officer in Lake Township, Ohio, Cutts was tasked with protecting the community and enforcing the law. However, behind the police uniform was a completely different person. Cutts and Jessie Marie Davis were living together in a tumultuous relationship, and the couple's unborn child was a sign of hope and a future. But just before Davis became pregnant with Cutts' child, their lives were threatened by hidden problems that no one could have predicted. On the night of June 14, 2007, after a heated argument, Cutts killed Davis. During the investigation, authorities discovered that Cutts had tried to create a false story to cover up his actions. He claimed that Davis had committed suicide, but evidence later revealed that this was a lie to protect himself from the crime he had committed. Traces from the crime scene, including traces of blood and cuts, conflicting statements, led police to the horrifying truth about the deaths of Davis and her unborn child. Each victim in this case is not just a human being, but also a symbol of hope and future. Jessie Marie Davis, a young mother, was robbed of her life while she was carrying an innocent child. Her unborn child was also brutally murdered, never having the chance to be born. Bobby Cutts Jr.'s actions were not only a crime against a woman, but also a deprivation of a future, a family that had not yet formed. This case raises questions not only about the instability of relationships, but also about the abuse of power. A police officer, who is responsible for protecting the people, used his authority to cover up a crime. Cutts' actions betrayed the trust that the community had placed in him. What happened next shows that no one, no matter who they are, can escape justice if they commit a crime. When the case went to trial, Bobby Cutts Jr. could not escape the crime he had committed. After months of investigation and trial, Cutts was convicted of first-degree murder, murder during pregnancy, and related charges. In February 2008, Cutts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This recognition of justice was not only a reward for Cutts' brutal actions, but also a powerful reminder that criminals must be held accountable for their actions, no matter who they are. This case is not just the story of a murderer, but also a warning to those in positions of power and responsibility that they should not abuse their power to harm others. The victims in this case are not only those who suffered loss, but also those who fought to find justice for what was lost. The story of Bobby Cutts Jr. is a story of abuse of power and the devastating consequences of domestic violence. Cutts, a police officer, harmed not just one person but an entire family. However, through this case, justice was served, and Cutts paid the price for his actions. This case is also a reminder of the importance of monitoring and controlling police officers who are responsible for protecting and serving the community. Matthew Kenny, 1978, age 47, Mississippi. Matthew Kenny, born in 1978, is a police officer in Oxford, Mississippi, where he served in the police force for many years. Before becoming a criminal, Kenny was known as a law enforcement officer with an upright image, serving the community and enforcing the law. However, behind the police uniform and reputation of a law enforcement officer, Kenny had an affair with Dominique Clayton, a young woman. When this relationship was discovered and Clayton threatened to reveal the truth, Kenny killed her to silence her and protect his personal image. Kenny was sentenced to life in prison for murder. A police officer, whom the community trusted to protect and enforce the law, turned into a murderer. Matthew Kenny, a police officer in Oxford, Mississippi, shocked everyone when he killed Dominique Clayton, a woman he had been romantically involved with. Why would an officer of justice kill a woman he once loved? This story is not only about abuse of power, but also a tragic love story full of guilt. This case shocked and opened up big questions about betrayal, deception, and crime from those who were supposed to protect. Matthew Kenny was a highly regarded police officer in Oxford, Mississippi, with many years of service in the police force. He took pride in his work, believed in protecting the community, and enforcing the law fairly. However, while carrying out his duty to protect justice, Kenny built a complicated and troubled personal life. Kenny began a romantic relationship with Dominique Clayton, a young woman, even though he was married with children. The relationship lasted for a long time, and even though Kenny knew it was an affair, he continued the relationship. However, when Dominique Clayton began to threaten to expose this affair, Kenny lost control and decided to kill her to protect his personal image and family. On the night of May 19, 2019, Kenny drove to Clayton's house on a rainy night. After an argument broke out, Kenny shot Clayton in the head while she was lying in bed, brutally ending her life. After the crime, Kenny returned to the police station and reported the incident as a murder. But investigators could not help but notice inconsistencies in his testimony. Eventually, the truth was revealed through evidence and witness testimony. The story of Matthew Kenny is not just a criminal case, but also a story of betrayal, deception, and crimes against relationships. Kenny not only harmed Dominique Clayton, but also took the life of a promising woman and destroyed family and community values. His actions not only caused suffering to the victim, but also to his own family, who will have to live with the pain and shame of his criminal actions. Why would a man in power, entrusted with the responsibility of protecting and enforcing the law, act in such a way? Why would Kenny choose to kill to protect a secret, rather than face the truth? These are questions that many people cannot find answers to, but this case once again shows the abuse of power and human weakness when put in stressful situations. Kenny could not escape justice. After a lengthy investigation, Kenny was arrested and convicted of first-degree murder in 2020. Throughout the trial, Kenny's lawyer tried to justify his actions, but could not change the facts. Kenny was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice was served, and Dominique Clayton, although tragically lost, at least received recognition for her life. Although Kenny sought to protect himself and his career by killing, he will have to face the price of this action for the rest of his life. This case is not only a lesson for those who abuse power, but also a warning for those who think they can escape responsibility for their actions. Justice will always find the truth, regardless of who commits the crime. 1975 Matthew Kenny was a soldier in the police force, but could not overcome his own weaknesses. When faced with the truth about his adulterous relationship, he chose the path of sin. Kenny's story is a reminder that no one, even the guardian of the law, can escape punishment when they commit serious crimes. This case ended with the recognition of justice, and one man paid the price for his actions. But for the rest, it leaves a lesson about the abuse of power and the consequences of hiding the truth. Wayne Couzens, 1972, age 53, London. Wayne Couzens, born in 1972, is a former police officer of the Metropolitan Police in London. Before committing the crime, Couzens was known as a police officer with a good record and had served in the police force since 2005. He was a member of the Special Protection Team, responsible for protecting important areas and high-ranking figures. However, behind the uniform and position of power, Cousins committed horrifying crimes. In March 2021, Cousins kidnapped, sexually assaulted and murdered Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old woman, causing a shocking case and sparking a major debate about abuse of power in the police service. Cousins was sentenced to life in prison. A police officer, whom the community trusted to protect and enforce the law, turned out to be a brutal murderer. Wayne Cousins, a member of the Metropolitan Police, committed one of London's most shocking crimes in 2021 when he kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered Sarah Everard. This case is not just a story of a brutal crime, but also a betrayal of society's trust in law enforcement. The question is, how could a police officer become a criminal? Wayne Cousins is a police officer with a history of nearly 15 years in the force. He joined the Metropolitan Police in 2005 and spent many years working in the area and VIP protection team. Although he was highly regarded for his work and was often tasked with protecting sensitive areas, Cousins kept terrifying secrets that no one could have suspected. In March 2021, Cousins abducted Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old woman, while she was walking home from an evening out in London. Cousins, who was on security duty in the area, stopped Sarah under the pretext of not wearing a face mask. After abducting her, Cousins sexually assaulted Sarah before killing her and hiding her body in a deserted area. What is frightening is that Cousins used his power and position to commit this crime. The incident shocked and outraged the community. Police, who were supposed to protect the public, were being made criminals, and it sparked a major debate about abuse of power in the police force. Subsequent investigations revealed shocking information about Cousins, including previous reports of misconduct and complaints of unacceptable behavior throughout his career. The story of Wayne Cousins is not just a story of murder, but a larger tragedy about the loss of trust in law enforcement. Sarah Everard, a young woman returning home, was victimized by someone who used his power and image as a cover for criminal acts. She was not only murdered, but also sexually assaulted before losing her life. This makes the case not just a death, but a serious betrayal of the community. Sarah Everard has become a symbol of the fear and insecurity that many women feel in society, especially when they are confronted by people they should trust, including the police. Cousins' actions have caused a wave of outrage and strong resistance from the community, especially from women who have always lived in fear for their own safety. The case has sparked discussions about police reform, ensuring that criminals, even police officers, face justice. After the case went to trial, Wayne Cousins was sentenced to life in prison for the abduction, sexual assault and murder of Sarah Everard. In September 2021, after a lengthy trial, Cousins pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a lengthy sentence, serving 19 months in prison for charges related to misconduct earlier in his career. Justice has been served, but the pain that Sarah Everard's family has endured cannot be alleviated. Cousins' sentence has created a turning point in protecting women's rights and safety, and has also opened up a broader discussion about the need for police reform. Sarah Everard's story has brought the community to face a harsh reality: abuse of power can come from those we trust the most. However, this case also emphasizes a strong message: no one, no matter who they are, can escape justice if they commit a crime. Wayne Cousins was a police officer whose job was to protect the community, but his betrayal of his profession and his community shocked everyone. Sarah Everard's story is an unforgettable tragedy, and Cousins' case is a reminder of the importance of oversight, reform, and protection of victims of crime involving police officers. Justice has been served, but this story will forever be a great lesson in protecting safety and fairness in society. David Carrick, 1972, age 53, London. David Carrick, born in 1972, is a former Metropolitan Police officer in London, England. Before his arrest, Carrick had served in the police force for more than 20 years, mainly protecting important areas, including protecting officials and parliament buildings. Despite being a high-ranking officer in the protection team, Carrick committed terrible crimes that no one expected. Throughout his career, he abused his power to sexually assault at least 12 women. Carrick was arrested in late 2022 and sentenced to life in prison in 2023 for his crimes. A police officer with more than 2 decades of service, tasked with protecting sensitive areas and officials, became a serial sex offender. David Carrick, a senior member of the Metropolitan Police, used his power and prestige to become a sex abuser. Carrick's story raises big questions about protection, oversight, and accountability for law enforcement. How could someone in such a high position cover up such crimes for more than 2 decades? David Carrick joined the Metropolitan Police in 2001, and throughout his career, he has held important positions in the Sensitive Areas Protection Team. Carrick is considered a professional officer who always completes his duties and has a good record in his work. However, behind the image of a model police officer is a completely different person. During his years in the police, Carrick used his power to force at least 12 women into sexual acts against their will. Carrick uses romantic relationships to control and abuse hazardous women. His victims were mainly women Carrick met through dating apps or in social relationships. He often exerted power and made his victims feel they had no choice but to comply. Carrick's sexual assaults spanned from 2003 to 2020, but victims were unable to report them for fear of retaliation, especially as Carrick was a police officer. Despite numerous reports of inappropriate behavior by Carrick throughout his career, the complaints were not fully investigated, and Carrick continued to work in the police force. This not only shows lax police oversight, but also shows a lack of accountability in handling complaints of abuse of power. Carrick's actions not only deprived victims of their safety, but also caused the community to lose faith in those they should trust to protect them. David Carrick not only harmed his victims, but he also destroyed the trust of an entire community in the police force. When a police officer becomes a criminal, especially in cases of sexual assault, it raises serious questions about oversight, accountability, and transparency in the police force. Carrick abused his power to control defenseless women, forcing them into a vicious cycle of violence with no way out. Carrick's story is not only a case of sexual crime, but also a wake-up call to society about the importance of controlling and supervising police officers. A criminal with such great power was able to abuse his position to harm victims for years without being detected. This not only caused suffering to the victims, but also made discussions about police reform and protecting victims' rights more urgent than ever. After years of investigation and reports from victims, David Carrick was finally arrested in late 2022 and tried in 2023. Throughout the trial, Carrick failed to justify his actions and was sentenced to life in prison for sexual abuse and related crimes. This sentence is not only a punishment for Carrick's actions, but also a powerful message that justice must be served for all, regardless of who the offender is. With this case over, justice has been served for Carrick's victims, but the loss and damage he caused cannot be easily erased. Carrick's victims suffered not only physically, but also psychologically, as they felt they could not stand up to such a powerful abuser. However, by seeking justice and demanding protection, they have helped change the way the legal system and police will handle similar cases in the future. David Carrick was a police officer who the community trusted to protect them, but who turned into a brutal criminal. His story is not only a tragedy for his victims, but also a major warning about abuses of power in the police force. Justice was eventually served, but this case highlights the need for reform and increased oversight in law enforcement. Carrick's actions should not destroy our faith in justice, but it will always be a reminder of the importance of protecting the rights and safety of victims in all circumstances. Nicholas Tartaglia, 1960, age 65, New York. Nicholas Tartaglia, born in 1960, is a former police officer in New York, where he served for many years before being arrested for murder. Before his crimes, Tartaglia was known as a law enforcement officer with a rather mysterious background, and there was no indication that he had any wrongdoing. However, in 2016, Tartaglia was arrested after committing a brutal murder, killing 4 people in a drug-related dispute. After being convicted, Tartaglia was sentenced to 4 life sentences and will never have the chance of parole. A police officer, whom the community trusted to protect and enforce the law, turned into a serial killer. Nicholas Tartaglia, a former New York police officer, committed one of the most brutal murders in recent history, killing 4 people in a drug dispute. The question is, how could a man entrusted with protecting turn into such an unthinkable crime? Nicholas Tartaglia, born and raised in New York, joined the police force in his early years. Before his arrest, he was a regular police officer with a stable job and no criminal record. However, what led Tartaglia to this brutal path of crime? It all started in April 2016, when Tartaglia was involved in a drug-related murder. Tartaglia had teamed up with a criminal group in a drug dispute. After the group's deal was broken, Tartaglia killed 4 people, including 3 men and a woman, all of whom were killed in a fierce gunfight. Tartaglia reportedly used extreme violence to solve his personal and financial problems, and showed no remorse for this brutal act. After the incident, Tartaglia tried to cover up his crimes and cover his tracks. But the truth was eventually revealed when the police conducted a thorough investigation. Tartaglia was later arrested and charged with mass murder. It is worth noting that, despite being a police officer in the past, he abused his power and position to commit these crimes. Tartaglia's actions not only betrayed the community's trust in the police force, but also opened up a discussion about control and supervision of those with power in society. Nicholas Tartaglia is not only a brutal murderer, but also a symbol of abuse of power and corruption in the police force. The victims in this case were not only deprived of their lives, but were also treated as pawns in a bloody game played by a man who had lost all morality and humanity. This murder is not only a criminal act, but also a reflection of the flaws in the legal system and police oversight. Tartaglia's sentence is not only justice for the victims, but also a strong reminder that power cannot be abused, and those who break the law, no matter who they are, must face the consequences. The pain of the victims' families cannot be erased, but at least Tartaglia's life sentence is a small consolation for them. Still, the case also raises important questions about the need for oversight and reform of law enforcement to ensure that no one, even a police officer, can abuse their power with impunity. After the case went to trial, Nicholas Tartaglia was sentenced to 4 life sentences for murder. His crimes included mass murder, the murder of a group of criminals in a drug dispute, and many other crimes. In October 2017, Tartaglia was convicted and formally sentenced for his brutal crimes. His actions were not just personal revenge, but also an act of breaking the basic principles of justice and protecting the community. Despite his conviction, the truth of Tartaglia's actions continues to raise major questions about the oversight of police officers and the justice system. This case has left the community heartbroken and forced to face a frightening reality. Not everyone in uniform can be trusted, and no one is exempt from justice, regardless of who they are. The story of Nicholas Tartaglian is a reminder of the dangers inherent in the abuse of power. A man entrusted to protect could turn into a terrible criminal who not only took the lives of 4 people, but also destroyed faith in the police and the legal system. Although the verdict has been reached, the case will always serve as an important lesson in oversight and accountability for those who enforce the law. Justice has been served, but the story of Tartaglian will continue to make us reflect on what can happen when power goes unchecked. Stephen Flood, 53 years old, State, South Carolina. Stephen Flood, a former Horry County Sheriff's deputy, was 69 at the time of the crime. He had served in law enforcement for more than 3 decades and was considered a seasoned veteran. However, his poor decision to drive through a flooded area ruined his career and his life. On the night of September 18, 2018, amid the fury of Hurricane Florence, 2 women seeking mental health help boarded a police transport vehicle for what would be their last ride. Wendy Newton, 45, and Nicolette Green, 43, were non-resisting, non-threatening, and simply wanted help. They believed in the system. They believed in the men in uniform. But the driver that night, Deputy Stephen Flood, led them down a road with no way out. And just hours later, as rushing floodwaters engulfed the patrol car, both women drowned in the darkness, locked in the back. 2 of Florence's 9 victims, but unlike those swept away by natural disasters, they died because of a human decision. Stephen Flood, nearly 70, was a veteran officer. One would expect his age and experience to help him make the right choice. But on that rainy night, despite a series of road closures, emergency warnings, and blockades due to rising water levels, Flood drove the van carrying 2 patients through Marion County, one of the worst hit areas. As they approached the blockade, the National Guard lowered the barricades, as regulations required them to allow emergency vehicles to pass. A brief exchange occurred. Then Flood continued driving into the murky water. Within minutes, the van was swept away by the rushing water, spinning and pinning itself against the guardrail. Flood and Deputy Joshua Bishop quickly escaped, but Wendy and Nicolette were trapped in the back, no exit, no way to break the lock. Bishop was so desperate that he pulled out a gun and tried to shoot the lock, but the rushing water made his efforts futile. In a short time, the van was completely submerged. In the darkness of the flood, 2 women died amid the roar of water and the groan of metal. They died under the watchful eyes of those tasked with protecting them. Shock rippled through South Carolina. Victims' families argued that the deaths did not need to be avoided. All of them could have been avoided if Flood had followed the road closure instructions. They described his actions as reckless, and inexcusable. In May 2022, after years of investigation and hundreds of hours of testimony, a jury found Stephen Flood guilty on all counts. 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter were later dismissed to avoid duplication, but 2 counts of reckless homicide stood. The judge imposed 18 years in prison to run consecutively. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Flood, once considered a trustworthy employee, now sees the rest of his life behind bars. But compared to the loss of 2 families, 18 years is just a number. In the civil case, Horry County agreed to pay $6.3 million. But money cannot restore what has been lost. We can't imagine how scared and devastated they were in the last minute, one family said. Flood, in 2025, still maintains he wasn't entirely wrong. He filed an appeal, arguing that the drone footage used in court was misleading and didn't accurately reflect the conditions when he drove into the water. But prosecutors responded that Flood's decision wasn't just wrong. It was fatally negligent, an action that went against all training. The story of Stephen Flood is not one of cold-blooded crime. It is a tragedy of bad decision, but a decision made by someone who holds the lives of others in his hands. And when power is placed in someone's hands, a moment of inattention can turn a mistake into a death sentence. Wendy Newton and Nicolette Green did not die because of the storm. They died because of complacency, recklessness, and misplaced faith. And perhaps that is what makes this case so haunting. Jesse Hernandez, 43 years old, States, Texas. Jesse Hernandez, 35 when convicted, was an officer with Corpus Christi PD and Robstown PD in Texas. He had a history of using deadly force and domestic violence. After shooting 2 police officers, Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On a 2013 day in Texas, 2 police officers, Officer Tiffany Kiram and Sekji Jesse Balderramas, responded to what seemed like a routine domestic disturbance call. A scream, a door opened, and seconds later, a gun barrel flashed. One bullet went straight into Kiram's face, another into Balderramas's leg. They didn't know that the man waiting behind the door was Jesse Hernandez, a former police officer who had killed dogs, shot civilians, and believed he had a license to use violence without restraint. But that night, in the house where his wife, whom he had beaten and broken her collarbone when she was pregnant, Hernandez showed his true colors. Someone even police officers were not safe to face. And that was the moment that transformed a man who once represented the law into the greatest threat to law enforcement itself. The incident began when neighbors called 911, reporting seeing Hernandez dragging his wife, Roseanne, into the house in a state of panic. When Officer Kiram and Sjeet Balderramas approached, they followed procedure: knock on the door, ask to verify safety. But Hernandez did not respond like a citizen in trouble. He responded like a man determined to fight to the end. The door opened. Hernandez pulled out a gun. Kiram had no time to react. The bullet pierced her face, shattering bones, disfiguring once familiar features. Balderramas tried to pull her out of harm's way and was shot in the leg. Strangely, in those chaotic seconds, Hernandez did not run, did not surrender, just stood there, as if repeating what he had done in the past when he shot a driver and called it self-defense, when he killed a Rottweiler and said he no choice. But this time, the victim did not stay silent, and 2 policemen survived to tell the truth. In court, the story got darker. His wife testified that Hernandez had long been a dangerous man, a man who pushed her, 6 months pregnant, hard enough to break her collarbone. She spoke of his irrational anger, of his cold, emotionless talk about shootings. Those statements painted a portrait of a man accustomed to violence, to whom violence was a default response. What happened that night was not an outburst. It was the result of a history that law enforcement had long ignored. In sentencing, the DA's office said Hernandez had proven he was not only a danger to the community, but also to the people he had been assigned to work with. A simple call for help turned into an ambush. It took the jury only a short time to decide guilty. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a rare sentence, especially for a former officer. In the courtroom, Roseanne burst into tears. She wasn't crying for the man who had been convicted. She was crying because finally, someone believed her. The case of Jesse Hernandez raises the most haunting question of all. How could an officer with a clear history of violence continue to wear a gun and a badge for so long? That question is not just for his victims, but for the entire system, where warnings are sometimes present but ignored until someone bleeds. Officer Kiram lives, but her face will forever bear the scars of that fateful night. Sjeet Balderramas continues to rehab, wearing the bullet on his leg as a reminder that the mission can change in an instant. And Hernandez, He will live the rest of his life behind bars, where violence is no longer a power, but a memory of a life of self-destruction. Michael A. Daughtro, age 44, State, New Jersey. Michael A. Daughtro, 40 at the time of his conviction, was a former Edison, New Jersey, police officer with more than a decade of service. He had a long history of violence, mental instability, and revenge. The Molotov cocktail attack on his superior's home ended his career and his freedom. A police officer tasked with protecting the public drops a Molotov cocktail into a home where children are sleeping. This is not fiction, but the shocking case of 2013, when Officer Michael Daughtro turned his personal anger into an act that could have killed a family of 4. That night, a fire broke out in the home of Captain Mark Andoko, the officer who had deemed Daughtro unfit for duty. After a series of complaints of violence, it was a professional judgment, but for Daughtro, it was an insult, and he chose revenge in a way no one expected. Before the night of the attack, Michael Daughtro was a household name within the Edison Police Department for reasons no department wants. 11 violence complaints, including unnecessary use of force, impaired conduct, conflicts with coworkers, intimidation and harassment, repeated psychological evaluations. He was considered a ticking time bomb, and everyone knew it. When Captain Andoko decided to put him on administrative leave and request a psychological evaluation, Daughtro didn't see it as an opportunity to mend. He saw it as a betrayal. In the early morning hours of May 23, 2013, Daughtro drove to Andoko's residence with one goal in mind: to burn down his boss's career, and nearly his entire family. He smashed a window and threw a flaming Molotov cocktail inside. The fire broke out while Andoko's wife, 2 young children, and his 92-year-old mother were inside the house. The family escaped death thanks to timely detection, but the severity of the attack shocked the entire community. As investigators from the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office expanded their investigation, they discovered that the Molotov cocktail was just the tip of the iceberg. A shocking list of charges, including repeatedly vandalizing a co-worker's car in retaliation, providing controlled substances while still in uniform, procuring controlled substances to criminals, intimidating witnesses, attempting to manipulate the outcome of an investigation, tampering with records to conceal wrongdoing, conspiracy to get even with another North Brunswick officer, an officer tasked with protecting the truth, manipulated, threatened, and fought against the very system he swore to serve. When confronted in court, Daughtro could not deny cameras, witnesses, and physical evidence pointed to him. The pressure was so great that he pleaded guilty to a series of charges: attempted murder, aggravated arson, official misconduct, conspiracy to tamper with a witness, conspiracy to retaliate. The judge called Daughtro's time as a police officer a complete lie, and emphasized the cruelty of throwing a Molotov cocktail into a sleeping family's home. The sentence was 20 years, with at least 85% to be served under the No Early Release Act. His expected release date is 2034. The Michael Daughtro case left a startling question for New Jersey police. How can an officer with 11 violence complaints continue to carry a gun and serve on duty? That question lingers because it nearly turned into a family massacre. It reveals something terrifying. Threats don't just come from outsiders, but sometimes from people with power, badges, and the ability to mask their danger with a uniform. Michael Daughtro has been removed from the force, but the damage to public trust remains. A police officer who chooses to burn down his boss's house. That's not an act of impulse. It's a sign of a system that missed too many warnings. And when those warnings are ignored, a Molotov flies through a window and nearly burns a police department's reputation. Giovanni Crespo, age 35, State, New Jersey. Giovanni Crespo, 26 at the time of his conviction, was a former Newark, New Jersey, police officer with less than 2 years of experience. His inexperience, impatience, and misjudgment of the situation led to a series of actions that resulted in the fatal shooting of Gregory Griffin, a driver, and he was sentenced to 27 years in prison. It was only a 5-minute chase, but those 5 minutes destroyed 3 lives. Driver Gregory Griffin died in agony, passenger Andrew Dixon was permanently injured, and a young officer named Giovanni Crespo stepped from the patrol car into a journey of no return, the New Jersey State Prison. That night in Newark, the red and blue lights of police cars reflected on the wet pavement. But the most haunting thing wasn't the light. It was the sound of gunfire, not once, but 3 times. And each time Crespo decided to leave the safety of the patrol car and shoot at a moving car. On January 28, 2019, Officer Crespo and his partner Eric Ortiz responded to a call about a Chrysler 300 fleeing a traffic checkpoint. They believed there were guns in the car. It was a risky situation, but also a familiar one for Newark police. However, what happened next was completely out of the norm. As the car swerved through the narrow street, Crespo jumped out of the patrol car for the first time. Bodycam footage captured him running close to the Chrysler and firing directly into the cabin. The car continued to flee. Ortiz, who appeared calmer, repeatedly yelled, "Calm down!" But Crespo didn't listen. A second and third time, Crespo jumped out of the car, pulled out a gun, and fired at the moving vehicle. There was no warning. There was no command to stop before shooting. There was no immediate threat to life. At the end of the chase on Irvine Turner Boulevard, Gregory Griffin was shot 3 times, including the fatal one. Dixon was shot in the face, survived but was scarred for life, and everything was clearly recorded by bodycam, every step, every shot, every wrong choice. When the video was released, a prosecutor said only one thing: "This is shoot, first policing, and it is illegal." During the trial, which lasted more than 10 weeks, the prosecutor made a strong case Crespo was young, inexperienced, but well trained in the rules of force. His decision to leave his car and fire into a moving vehicle did not constitute any threat that warranted the use of deadly force. Forensic experts reconstructed the scene. There was no gun pointed at the police. There was no direct assault. Only poor judgment and recklessness. Meanwhile, the defense said Crespo genuinely believed he saw a gun in the car. But the video never supported that claim. The victim's Griffin's family said Gregory was not perfect, but he did not deserve to die that way. His son stood in court and asked, "Why did he shoot my father like an animal?" Crespo cried, for the only time during the trial. But when the verdict came, nothing could be done about it. The Giovanni Crespo case is more than a story of personal error. It is a reminder of a larger problem, the dangers of shoot first, think later in law enforcement. A 26-year-old officer, hot-headed and lacking in restraint, made 3 decisions in a matter of minutes. 3 decisions that killed one man, seriously injured another, and destroyed his own life. And it was all captured on a tiny camera strapped to the chest of a witness who could not lie. As the courtroom doors closed and Crespo was escorted out, it became clear that justice is not always swift, but when it arrives, it leaves no room for excuses. A night of car chases, 3 pulls of the trigger, a 27-year sentence. And the burning question remains: what would this case have been like without the body cam? No Juarez, 47 years old, State, Texas. No Juarez, 47 when convicted, was a veteran of the Houston Police Department and a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. Highly regarded by his colleagues, but secretly involved in assisting the Los Zetas cartel, Juarez was sentenced to 365 months in federal prison for drug trafficking conspiracy and weapons supply. No one would have thought that one of the Houston Police Department's most decorated officers would be the one to open the door to one of Mexico's most brutal cartels. But as Juarez's story unfolds, it becomes clear that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one they trust the most. The betrayal didn't happen overnight, but rather involved a series of backroom deals, guns smuggled behind the scenes, and lives potentially lost because an officer was willing to sell his honor for money and power. Juarez's case began as a faint echo among dozens of DEA investigations. But gradually, the name, Juarez, appeared repeatedly in the testimony of dealers, in extracted phone records, and finally in top, secret videos that showed a scene no one would forget: a Houston PD officer, in full uniform, coldly handing over weapons to Los Zetas cartel members in front of a nightclub he managed. When investigators discovered the footage, they knew they were dealing not just with a corrupt cop, but with a key link in a network that was moving thousands of kilograms of drugs across several states in the United States. Juarez was once considered Houston's frontline defender, but he was really a protector of the interests of the Los Zetas cartel. For years, he supplied the cartel with tools that no criminal organization should have access to: confidential information on police operations, tracked license plates, ambush tactics, patrol schedules, even armored vehicles, body armor, and semi-automatic guns. What was meant to protect civilians was now used by drug traffickers to kill each other. One witness testified that Juarez cleared the way for the cartel's goods to travel through Texas into Mississippi, Florida, Maryland, and New York. With each successful delivery, the cartel's trust in him grew. And when the cartel handed over the responsibility of supplying weapons to Mexican commanders, Juarez did not refuse. On the contrary, he did everything with ease, as if he had done it many times before. Juarez's trial was one that prompted prosecutors to describe him as a dangerous betrayal. Jurors were shown video of him in his Houston police uniform, with body armor wrapped around his arms, surrendering his weapons as if it were his official job. His wife was not in court for the sentencing. Some former colleagues said they felt bordering on treason when they learned that Juarez had supplied weapons to Los Zetas, considered one of the most brutal gangs in the Western Hemisphere. One DEA investigator said that each gun Juarez handed over could be tied to multiple bodies whose identities we will never find. Finally, the prosecutors laid out the incontrovertible numbers. Between 2006 and 2011, Juarez had facilitated a multi-million-dollar interstate drug trafficking operation that spanned at least 5 states and thousands of kilograms of illegal substances. His sentence of 365 months in federal prison, 30.5 years, was a stark statement that the title of police officer would not save a man who had betrayed his country. In the courtroom, Juarez stood silent, offering no apology, no defense. Perhaps he himself understood that no words could save the honor he had burned with his own hands so many years before. As the courtroom doors closed, a federal judge told reporters that the case is a classic example of a police officer becoming a tool of the cartel. A man who once carried a gun to protect his city now faces the rest of his life behind bars because of the guns he supplied. And Juarez's story reminds us that in the criminal world, it's not the man with the gun on the street who's to be feared. It's the man with the gun in uniform. Braulio Gonzalez, 51 years old, State, Florida. Braulio Gonzalez, 48 when convicted, was a lieutenant with the Miami-Dade Police Department Special Response Team, SRT. He was considered an experienced tactical officer, But his history of allegations of violence against women and child abuse ended his career with a sentence of life in prison without parole. During his nearly two-decade career with the Miami-Dade Police Department, Lieutenant Braulio Gonzalez was hailed as a key member of the Special Response Team, leading the charge in some of the most dangerous missions, facing situations that many officers would have flinched from. But behind that facade of glory lay a dark truth that no one expected to exist within the man he was tasked with protecting. Allegations of violence against women had dogged him for years. Yet somehow he always escaped discipline. Cases were labeled insufficient evidence. Internal reports were inconclusive. And the system always seemed to give him another chance. And it was those chances that allowed a predator to continue operating in the shadows. It was only when the two girls, aged between 8 and 10, decided to speak out about what had haunted them throughout their childhood that their testimony was so clear and detailed that it silenced the courtroom. They told of Gonzalez touching them, of the threats, of the gun he held to their heads to silence them. There was no confusion, no possibility of error, no childish imagination. These were the accounts of young victims who had endured too much fear for their short lives. And for the first time, the truth about Gonzalez was no longer hidden. As the trial began, it took prosecutors just minutes to build a picture of a man who led a double life, a model police officer in public and a professional sexual predator behind closed doors. The details poured in. Old allegations that had been ignored, complaints ignored, warnings ignored throughout Gonzalez's career. They made a chilling point. This case was not just a failure of one individual, but also a failure of a system that failed to protect its victims. The pivotal moment of the trial came so quickly that no one expected it. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury needed only 15 minutes, one of the fastest verdicts in Florida child abuse history. There was no debate, no hesitation, no doubt about his guilt. Gonzalez stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face expressionless. No apology, no reaction. But behind him, the victim's family burst into tears, not because of the moment of triumph, but because justice had finally filled the void left by silence for so long. Gonzalez's life sentence without parole was the end of his freedom. In his final remarks, the judge emphasized that this was one of the most profound betrayals of public trust. A police officer not only committed a crime, but also used his position, power, and the presence of a gun to threaten defenseless children. He not only broke the law, but also the most sacred safety in society, the innocent childhood of children. As Gonzalez was led from the courtroom, many could not help but wonder, how many times had he gotten away with it before? How many warnings had he ignored? And how many people had paid the price before he was stopped? This case was not just about the sins of one man, but also a stark reminder that not everyone with a badge is a protector. Sometimes, they are the ones the community needs to be protected from. And in the cold silence of the prison, where he would spend the rest of his life, Braulio Gonzalez had no power, no gun, and no uniform that once shielded him. There was only the truth, and that truth had finally won. Joseph James D'Angelo, State, California, age 80 years old, sentenced to life. Joseph James D'Angelo was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, a quiet town that offered no early warning of the violence that would later define his name. In the late 1960s, D'Angelo enlisted in the United States Navy and served during the Vietnam War. Military life imposed discipline, routine, and obedience, traits often praised, rarely questioned. For D'Angelo, the structure of the armed forces reinforced emotional suppression and an ability to compartmentalize violence. He learned to function under stress, to follow procedures precisely, and to detach action from empathy. When he returned home, he carried those habits with him, blending seamlessly into civilian life while quietly refining the traits that would later help him evade capture. By 1973, D'Angelo had entered law enforcement, beginning his career as a police officer in California with the Exeter Police Department. He received formal training in patrol tactics, crime scene management, emergency response, and investigative procedure. This education placed him on the inside of the system designed to stop criminals like himself. The first warning signs emerged between 1974 and 1975 in Visalia, California. A series of nighttime burglaries rattled the community. Homes were entered quietly, personal items moved or stolen, and signs of prolonged surveillance were left behind. The press dubbed the unknown offender the Visalia ransacker. What seemed at first like property crime carried a disturbing undertone. The intruder lingered, studied routines, and focused on women. These were not impulsive break-ins. They were rehearsals. D'Angelo was learning how neighborhoods slept. In 1976, D'Angelo's police career abruptly ended when he was caught shoplifting from a hardware store. He was fired but not criminally prosecuted in any meaningful way. There was no deep background investigation, no psychological review, no broader inquiry into his behavior. The system closed the door quietly and moved on. That same year, D'Angelo escalated. The loss of his badge did not remove his knowledge, it freed it from oversight. From 1976 to 1979, Northern California experienced a wave of sexual assaults, unlike anything seen before. The offender became known as the East Area Rapist, or EAR. He attacked at night, often after weeks of surveillance. He listened to police radio frequencies to stay ahead of responding officers. He bound victims using shoelaces or cords found inside their own homes. He stacked dishes or other objects on victims' backs as makeshift alarms, ensuring compliance through fear. Despite massive police task forces, composite sketches, and community patrols, investigators were completely outmatched. The perpetrator understood their methods because he had once been one of them. Between 1979 and 1981, the violence spread south. The crimes grew deadlier. Victims were no longer left alive. Couples were targeted in their homes, bludgeoned or shot after prolonged terror. The offender earned a new name, the original Night Stalker. The transition from rape to murder marked a chilling evolution. This was no longer about control alone, it was about domination without witnesses. From 1981 to 1986, D'Angelo committed at least 13 confirmed murders. Then, as suddenly as the violence had begun, it stopped. No dramatic arrest followed, no confrontation. The killer simply vanished. For decades, the case went cold. Investigators had DNA but no name, no suspect, no clear path forward. D'Angelo lived quietly, married, raised children, worked ordinary jobs. He blended into suburban life, another retired man mowing his lawn. In the 1990s and 2000s, advances in forensic science linked the Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker into a single offender. The scope of the crimes became clearer, but the identity remained elusive. Traditional investigative techniques had reached their limit. Everything changed in 2018. Detectives turned to investigative genetic genealogy, uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases. By tracing familial matches, they narrowed the suspect pool until only one name remained. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was 72 years old, a former police officer, a grandfather. The monster had been hiding in plain sight. Between 2018 and 2020, D'Angelo faced charges for murder, rape, and kidnapping. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. In June 2020, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The court acknowledged not just the crimes, but the systemic failure that allowed them to continue for so long. Today, the D'Angelo case stands as a global symbol of betrayal, of how specialized knowledge can be weaponized, how institutions can be blind to threats within, and how justice sometimes waits decades for technology to catch up. The question remains unsettling. How many other predators learned the system well enough to disappear before science could find them? Stephen Caracappa, State, New York, age deceased, died 2017, sentenced to life. Born in 1942 in New York, Stephen Caracappa came of age in a city where organized crime and law enforcement had long existed in uneasy proximity. In 1969, Caracappa joined the New York City Police Department, entering the force during one of its most volatile eras. Mafia families still exerted real control over neighborhoods, unions, and businesses, and detectives working major cases occupied a privileged position. As Caracappa rose within the department, he gained access to sensitive intelligence, confidential informants, wiretap targets, surveillance schedules, and internal strategies. On paper, he was doing the work the city demanded. In reality, that access quietly positioned him on both sides of the law. By the 1980s, Caracappa's role inside the NYPD overlapped dangerously with the criminal underworld. During this period, he formed a secret alliance with members of the Lucchese crime family, most notably Anthony Jaspipe Casso, one of the most violent mob figures of the era. What began as leaks of information evolved into a systematic operation. Caracappa sold the names of police informants, exposed active investigations, and revealed arrest plans. For the mafia, this intelligence meant survival. For those who trusted the police with their lives, it was a death sentence. The consequences were immediate and lethal. At least 8 murders have been directly tied to Caracappa's actions, either through his participation or his facilitation. Several victims were cooperating witnesses, people who believed the NYPD would protect them if they told the truth. Instead, their identities were handed to organized crime. They were abducted, interrogated, and executed. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Caracappa continued to operate with apparent impunity. Internal safeguards failed. Oversight mechanisms did not detect the pattern. The idea that a decorated detective could be functioning as a mafia asset was almost unthinkable, and that disbelief became a shield. Eventually, Caracappa left the NYPD in the early 1990s, severing his formal ties to the department but not to the criminal world. Alongside his longtime associate Luis Eppolito, he moved across multiple states, maintaining contact with underworld figures while attempting to stay ahead of suspicion. Federal investigators began circling during the 1990s, but the case was difficult to build. Much of the evidence lived inside the mafia itself, sealed behind fear, loyalty, and omerta. For years, rumors persisted that corrupt cops had facilitated mob executions, but without insider testimony, the allegations remained just out of reach. Caracappa and Eppolito lived freely, benefiting from the same silence they had once sold. That silence began to crack in the late 1990s and early 2000s as federal prosecutors intensified efforts to dismantle the remnants of New York's crime families. Cooperating witnesses, former mobsters facing life sentences, started talking. Their stories, given independently, began to align. They described 2 former NYPD detectives who provided intelligence and assisted in murders. Names emerged. Patterns became visible. What once sounded implausible now appeared systematic. In 2005, the reckoning arrived. Stephen Caracappa and Luis Eppolito were arrested and charged in federal court. The indictments were sweeping: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. Prosecutors argued that Caracappa had not merely enabled crime, but had become an active participant in it, using his badge as cover. The trial exposed how deeply embedded the betrayal had been, and how long it had gone unchecked. In 2009, a federal jury delivered its verdict. Caracappa was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, plus additional decades, ensuring he would never be released. The court made its position clear: his status as a police officer did not mitigate his crimes, it aggravated them. By exploiting public trust and law enforcement authority, he had multiplied the harm. Each murder carried not just a victim, but a message that the system itself could not be trusted. Stephen Caracappa died in prison in 2011 while serving his life sentence. There was no pardon, no commutation, no reduction. His death closed the legal chapter, but not the moral one. The damage he caused extended beyond the lives he helped end. It poisoned investigations, destroyed informant networks, and reinforced the fear that telling the truth could be fatal. His case remains one of the most disturbing examples of institutional betrayal in American criminal history. A reminder that when those entrusted to enforce the law decide to sell it instead, the cost is measured not just in bodies, but in broken faith. Daniel Kyle Holtzclaw, State, Oklahoma, age 38 years old, sentenced to life. Born in 1987 in Oklahoma, Daniel Kyle Holtzclaw grew up in a household shaped by military structure and strict discipline. In early 2014, Holtzclaw joined the Oklahoma City Police Department. He was young, confident, and newly empowered with a badge, a patrol car, and the legal authority to stop, search, question, and detain citizens. He was assigned to patrol areas of Oklahoma City marked by poverty, heavy policing, and long-standing distrust between residents and law enforcement. By late 2014 and into early 2015, a pattern quietly emerged. While on duty, Holtzclaw began sexually assaulting women he encountered during traffic stops and street encounters. He did not rely on brute force alone. Instead, he weaponized his authority. He threatened arrest. He implied criminal charges. He suggested that compliance would make problems disappear. The assaults followed a consistent script: vague traffic stops, invasive searches, isolation, and coercion. The victims shared more than trauma. They shared the knowledge that reporting a police officer could cost them their freedom, their credibility, or their safety. For months, the crimes continued without interruption. Each assault reinforced the same assumption, that the system would protect him, not them. The victims were disproportionately black women, many with prior convictions or substance abuse histories. In the eyes of the system, they were unreliable narrators. That perception became his shield. In June 2015, the pattern cracked. One woman chose to report what had happened to her, fully aware of the risks. Her decision marked the turning point. Investigators noticed something they could not ignore. Her account mirrored others they had quietly received, but never fully connected. The details lined up too cleanly. This was not an isolated allegation. It was a serial abuse of power. As the investigation widened in mid-2015, more women came forward. Their stories overlapped in disturbing ways. They described being stopped without clear cause, subjected to invasive searches that crossed into sexual assault, and coerced through threats of arrest. The consistency was undeniable. Internal Affairs took action. Holtzclaw was suspended, then fired from the Oklahoma City Police Department. The badge that had enabled the crimes was gone, but the damage remained. In August 2015, Daniel Holtzclaw was arrested. Prosecutors filed a sweeping list of charges, including rape, sexual battery, and using his position as a police officer to force compliance. The arrest itself sent shockwaves through the city. A police officer accused by multiple women. Women the system had historically ignored, challenged deeply embedded assumptions about credibility, race, and power. The trial that followed in 2015 and 2016 became a national spectacle. The prosecution built its case not on a single accusation, but on a pattern. Multiple victims testified independently, describing nearly identical encounters. GPS data from Holtzclaw's patrol car placed him at the exact locations and times described by the women. Dispatch logs confirmed his presence. The evidence formed a timeline that was difficult to dismiss. This was not a case of conflicting stories. It was a map of repeated behavior. The defense attacked the credibility of the victims, pointing to criminal records and substance use, echoing the very biases that had kept the crimes hidden for so long. The courtroom became a battleground over whose voices mattered. The trial exposed broader issues that extended far beyond one officer, racial bias in policing, the routine dismissal of marginalized victims, and a culture that discourages reporting misconduct within law enforcement. In December 2015, the jury delivered its verdict. Holtzclaw was found guilty on 18 of the 36 counts against him. The court concluded that he had systematically abused his authority as a police officer to commit sexual crimes. This was not impulsive misconduct. It was deliberate, repeated, and enabled by the power of the badge. In January 2016, sentencing followed. Daniel Holtzclaw received 263 years in prison. The number was symbolic as much as punitive, a clear statement that he would never re-enter society. For the victims, it was validation long denied. For the justice system, it was an admission that the harm had been allowed to continue for far too long. After 2020, the case became a national reference point. It is cited in discussions about police misconduct, sexual violence, and systemic racism. More than a criminal case, it became a warning. Holtzclaw's crimes revealed how easily power can be misused when oversight fails, and how silence, forced by fear, can allow abuse to flourish. The legacy of the case is not only about one officer's fall, but about the cost of ignoring the voices least likely to be heard. Adam Coy, State, Ohio, age approximately 49 years old, sentenced to life. December 27, 2020 began as a routine call, the kind police departments classify as non-emergency. Adam Coy and another Columbus police officer were dispatched to a garage in a residential neighborhood. There was no report of violence in progress, no weapon mentioned, no immediate threat. Inside the garage stood Andre Hill, a black man holding a cell phone in his hand. Within seconds of approaching, Coy fired a single shot. Hill collapsed to the floor and died where he fell. The encounter was over almost as quickly as it began, leaving behind a body, unanswered questions, and a moment that would reverberate far beyond Columbus. What followed made the shooting impossible to ignore. Coy had not activated his body camera before making contact, despite department policy requiring it. Only after firing the fatal shot did the camera turn on, capturing the aftermath rather than the decision itself. The missing footage became as important as the bullet. In use of force cases, seconds matter. In this one, those seconds were undocumented, leaving the public to rely on inference instead of transparency. Columbus police later confirmed that Coy's failure to activate his camera violated department rules, compounding the gravity of the shooting. As news spread in the final days of 2020, the killing of Andre Hill ignited national outrage. The country was already raw from months of protests under the banner of Black Lives Matter, fueled by earlier police killings of unarmed black men. Hill's death fit an all too familiar pattern. An unarmed civilian, a rapid escalation, and a fatal outcome justified after the fact. Demonstrations erupted. Community leaders demanded accountability. Hill's family called for criminal charges, insisting that what happened was not a tragic mistake, but an unjustifiable act of lethal force. Within days, Adam Coy was fired from the Columbus Police Department. The termination was swift by institutional standards, an acknowledgement that procedures had been broken in ways the department could not defend. Officials confirmed that Coy violated policy on both body camera use and the application of deadly force. The firing marked a rare moment when administrative consequences came quickly, but for many, it was not enough. The central question remained unresolved: would this officer face criminal responsibility, or would the system once again close ranks? In 2021, prosecutors answered that question. Adam Coy was formally charged in connection with Andre Hill's death. The state argued that Hill posed no immediate threat, that he was not armed, and that Coy had no legal justification to use deadly force. The charging decision itself was significant. Historically, officers involved in fatal shootings often avoid prosecution altogether. This case signaled a shift, at least in willingness, toward testing police actions against criminal law rather than internal discipline alone. The case moved slowly, grinding through pretrial motions and public scrutiny. By the time it reached the courtroom in 2023 and 2024, it had become more than a single homicide trial. Prosecutors presented body camera footage, dispatch records, and expert testimony on police use of force. The absence of early camera footage was dissected in detail, with experts explaining how policy violations erode accountability and increase the risk of unnecessary violence. Witnesses emphasized that Andre Hill held only a phone, that no warning was clearly given, and that no imminent danger justified a split-second decision to shoot. The defense focused on perception and fear, arguing that Coy believed Hill posed a threat in a confined space. But the prosecution returned again and again to the same points: Hill was unarmed. There was no active aggression, and Coy failed to follow basic protocol. The jury was asked to consider not just what Coy claimed he felt, but what a reasonable officer should have done under the same circumstances. The trial forced a broader conversation into the courtroom about training discretion and how quickly authority can turn fatal when unchecked. In 2024, the verdict arrived. Adam Coy was convicted, and the sentence followed 15 years to life in prison. The court concluded that the shooting was unnecessary and outside the bounds of lawful policing. It was a rare outcome in cases involving on-duty officers and lethal force. For Andre Hill's family, it represented a measure of accountability long denied in similar cases. For law enforcement nationwide, it sent a clear message that violating policy and killing without justification could carry the same consequences as civilian crime. The killing of Andre Hill and the conviction of Adam Coy reshaped expectations. It underscored how quickly a routine call can turn lethal, how procedural shortcuts can erase trust, and how accountability hinges on evidence that is either captured or never recorded at all. In the end, the case did not just judge one officer's actions. It exposed the fragile line between authority and abuse, and asked a question that continues to haunt American policing. When transparency fails in the moment, can justice ever truly catch up afterward? Len Davis, State, Louisiana, age 61 years old, sentenced to life. Born in 1964 in Louisiana, Len Davis grew up in an urban landscape where crime and corruption were not abstract concepts, but daily realities. In the early 1990s, while serving with the New Orleans Police Department, Davis moved beyond routine misconduct and into outright criminal enterprise. Investigators would later allege that he leveraged his position to protect local drug traffickers, shaking down dealers during narcotics busts and skimming cash that never made it into evidence. Civilians described threats and intimidation meant to ensure silence. Complaints circulated internally about excessive force and abuse of authority. But the department's culture, long plagued by corruption, absorbed them without decisive action. Each unaddressed warning reinforced the same lesson: power, once granted, could be used without consequence. Before 1994, one complaint stood out. Kim Groves, a civilian with no special protection, formally accused Len Davis of police brutality. Her complaint was documented, placing Davis at risk of discipline and scrutiny. In most systems, that paper trail would trigger oversight. In New Orleans at the time, it marked Groves as a problem. She had challenged an officer who understood the streets, the dealers, and the value of fear. For Davis, the complaint was not a professional inconvenience, it was a threat to his operation. In October 1994, that threat was answered with lethal finality. Prosecutors later established that Davis ordered a drug dealer and contract killer to murder Kim Groves. She was shot to death outside her home in New Orleans. A calculated killing meant to accomplish two goals: at once eliminate the complainant and send a message to anyone else considering speaking up. This was not a crime of passion or panic. It was a directive issued by a police officer who believed his authority extended beyond the law itself. The murder triggered a response that local systems could no longer contain. Federal authorities stepped in. The FBI opened a wide-ranging investigation into police corruption within the NOPD, pulling apart networks that had operated openly for years. Witnesses began cooperating. Drug traffickers described protection schemes. Associates confirmed Davis's role as both enforcer and organizer. The wall of silence cracked under federal pressure, revealing a structure that had allowed a sworn officer to function as a criminal gatekeeper. In 1995, Len Davis was arrested and indicted in federal court. The charges were sweeping conspiracy to commit murder, violations of civil rights, corruption, and drug-related offenses. The prosecution's theory was blunt and unprecedented in its implications. Davis had used his badge as a weapon, ordering the execution of a citizen for exercising her right to complain about police misconduct. The case reframed the murder not just as a homicide, but as an assault on the rule of law itself. The trial in 1996 was a reckoning. Jurors heard testimony detailing how Davis orchestrated the killing, how intermediaries carried out the order, and how fear kept witnesses silent until federal protections were in place. The evidence painted a picture of power unchecked and intentionally violent. When the verdict came down, it carried historic weight. Len Davis was sentenced to death in federal court, one of the rare instances in which a U.S. police officer received a capital sentence. The court emphasized that this was not merely corruption, it was an extreme abuse of authority that struck at the foundation of civil rights. Between 2005 and 2020, Davis lived under a death sentence, his name resurfacing in ethics training, legal scholarship, and true crime narratives. The case became shorthand for a chilling truth: when oversight fails, a single officer can terrorize an entire community. Kim Groves's name, once nearly erased, came to represent the cost of speaking out and the danger of systems that punish whistleblowers instead of abusers. In 2024, the legal trajectory shifted. President Joe Biden commuted Len Davis's death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The commutation did not question the verdict or suggest innocence. It reduced the punishment while leaving the conviction intact. For some, it reignited debate over capital punishment. For others, it was a procedural change that did nothing to soften the underlying horror of the crime. After 2024, Len Davis continued serving life in federal prison. The question his story leaves behind is not whether justice was eventually done, but how long it took, and how many voices were nearly lost before the system finally listened. These cases are not about isolated, bad apples, but about systems that allowed warning signs to be ignored, complaints to be buried, and trust to be weaponized. Each victim paid the price for silence, disbelief, or delayed accountability. Justice eventually arrived, but often decades too late. As technology improves and scrutiny increases, one question remains unavoidable. If those sworn to protect can abuse power so completely, how strong does oversight truly need to be to stop it next time? James Duckett, State, Florida, 68 years old, death row. James Duckett did not arrive in Mascot, Florida as a man already marked by scandal. In the early to mid-1980s, he was a local police officer, one of the uniformed figures residents associated with order in a small community. On the evening of September 26, 1987, that sense of normalcy fractured. Teresa McAbee, an 11-year-old girl, disappeared while riding her bicycle near her home in Mascot. It was the kind of disappearance that initially sparked confusion rather than immediate panic, a child overdue. A bike ride that lasted longer than expected, a town assuming the situation would resolve itself. But as hours passed, concern escalated. What investigators would later establish is that during this same time window, James Duckett was on duty. He was wearing his uniform, driving his patrol vehicle, and operating under the authority of the badge. According to the conclusions reached by investigators, Duckett used that authority and the automatic trust it commanded to approach Teresa. The encounter did not occur in a hidden or extraordinary setting. It unfolded within the ordinary landscape of a small town, under conditions that would not have immediately alarmed a child or passers-by. The following day, September 27, 1987, Teresa McAbee's body was discovered in a nearby pond. The recovery transformed a missing child case into a homicide investigation overnight. From that moment forward, law enforcement faced an uncomfortable reality. The crime scene did not point outward toward a stranger passing through town, but inward toward someone who understood police procedure, response times, and investigative blind spots. As forensic work progressed through the final months of 1987, evidence began to narrow the focus. Hair recovered from the victim was analyzed using microscopic comparison techniques, a standard forensic method widely accepted in courts at the time. Analysts concluded that the hair was consistent with James Duckett. Investigators also identified witnesses who stated they had seen Duckett near Teresa, approaching her while in his patrol car. Piece by piece, the case shifted from uncertainty to accusation. By early 1988, James Duckett was arrested and formally charged. The list of accusations reflected not only the severity of the crime, but the breach of professional duty. It represented sexual assault of a minor, aggravated homicide, and abuse of authority while on duty. The trial that followed later that year became a focal point for the community and the state. Prosecutors built their case around two central pillars: witness testimony placing Duckett at the scene and forensic hair evidence linking him to the victim. The defense, in turn, challenged the reliability of hair comparison analysis, arguing that the science was overstated and lacked the precision jurors were being led to believe it possessed. Despite those objections, the jury convicted Duckett in 1988, and the court imposed a sentence of death. For many cases, a conviction signals closure. In the Duckett case, it marked the beginning of a decades-long legal battle. From 1989 through the 2000s, Duckett filed multiple appeals, repeatedly contesting the scientific validity of the hair evidence and alleging procedural errors during his trial. These appeals unfolded alongside a broader shift in forensic science, as researchers and courts increasingly questioned the reliability of microscopic hair analysis. A method once treated as near-conclusive, later criticized for subjectivity and lack of statistical grounding. Yet, despite evolving scientific standards, appellate courts consistently upheld Duckett's conviction and sentence, ruling that the original proceedings met the legal thresholds required at the time. As of 2025, James Duckett remains on death row, with no execution date scheduled. His case continues to surface in legal scholarship, reform debates, and true crime analysis, not only because of the crime itself, but because of what it represents. It is cited in discussions about outdated forensic methods, the unique dangers posed when law enforcement authority is abused, and the irreversible consequences of capital punishment in cases shadowed by evidentiary controversy. The Duckett case forces an uncomfortable reckonings when the system places its trust in a badge. What safeguards truly exist when that trust is betrayed? And how certain must we be before the state carries out its most final sentence? Manuel Pardo Jr., State, Florida, 56 years old, execution date 111/2012. Manuel Pardo Jr. did not begin his adult life as an outsider to the law. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he wore the uniform of authority, first with the Florida Highway Patrol and later with the Sweetwater Police Department. That belief crystallized in March 1986. In Miami-Dade County, the first killing attributed to Pardo occurred with little initial fanfare. The victim had ties to drug activity, was shot with a handgun at close range, and appeared to be the target of a deliberate execution rather than a spontaneous act. At the time, it fit a pattern familiar to investigators in South Florida: violence within criminal networks, quickly absorbed into an already crowded caseload. What no one recognized yet was that this was not an isolated incident, but the opening act of a carefully paced sequence. Over the next 3 months, from March through June of 1986, 9 people were killed. The similarities were impossible to ignore in hindsight. Most of the victims had criminal histories or connections to drug trafficking. Each killing bore the marks of control and intent, rather than chaos. Some of the bodies displayed a chilling signature: ears removed, a symbolic gesture investigators would later interpret as a form of trophy-taking. During this same period, Pardo kept a personal journal, meticulously recording details of the killings. In those pages, he did not describe himself as a murderer. He described himself as a vigilante, a self-appointed executioner tasked with cleansing society of those he deemed irredeemable. This was not violence driven by impulse or desperation. It was methodical. Pardo used his law enforcement training to anticipate investigative responses, to choose locations and timing that minimized immediate suspicion, and to blend into the background of a city accustomed to violence. His familiarity with police procedure allowed him to move confidently, even arrogantly, through the aftermath of each killing. He believed that his understanding of criminal behavior and his prior badge placed him on the same moral side as the officers who would eventually be assigned to hunt him. By mid-1986, that confidence began to unravel. Detectives noticed patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Ballistics evidence linked multiple crime scenes. Witness statements and information from within criminal circles began to converge on a single figure who did not fit the profile of a typical street-level suspect. In June 1986, Manuel Pardo Jr. was arrested. The man who had framed himself as an invisible force of order was suddenly exposed to the full weight of the system he believed he had mastered. During interrogation, Pardo showed little remorse. He did not deny responsibility in the way most suspects do. Instead, he defended his actions. He spoke openly about cleaning up society, positioning himself as a necessary corrective to what he viewed as institutional failure. This posture would define every phase of his legal journey. From the beginning, Pardo was not interested in mitigation or redemption. He was interested in justification. The trial began in 1987 and quickly became as much about ideology as evidence. Prosecutors presented the journal entries, the ballistics matches, and a narrative of premeditated violence rooted in a distorted sense of moral authority. The defense struggled to counter the volume and coherence of the evidence. At times, Pardo represented himself or disrupted proceedings, using the courtroom as a platform to reiterate his vigilante beliefs. His behavior reinforced the prosecution's argument. This was not a man who lost control, but one who believed control entitled him to kill. In 1988, the verdict was delivered. Manuel Pardo Jr. was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. For the families of the victims, the sentence marked accountability. For legal observers, it marked the beginning of a long appellate process that would test the limits of tolerance for ideological violence carried out under the shadow of former authority. On December 11, 2012, at Florida State Prison, Manuel Pardo Jr. was executed by lethal injection. No official statement of remorse was recorded. The case closed more than 26 years after the first killing, but its implications endured. Pardo's story remains a stark warning about what happens when authority, ideology, and unchecked certainty collide. It raises an enduring question at the heart of true crime and criminal justice alike. When someone trained to enforce the law decides to rewrite it, how many lives are lost before the system recognizes the threat? Jeffrey Hodge, State, Ohio, 56 years old, sentenced to life. Jeffrey Hodge entered law enforcement quietly, without the warning signs that later hindsight would search for. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, he worked as a police officer for the University of Toledo Police Department in Ohio, a role designed to provide safety within an academic environment. On the night of January 14, 1992, that trust was shattered. Melissa Herstrom, a 19-year-old university student, disappeared while on the University of Toledo campus. At first, there was confusion rather than immediate alarm. College campuses are fluid spaces, and students move in and out of dorms, libraries, and parking areas at all hours. But as the night passed with no contact from Melissa, concern began to harden into fear. What investigators later established was that during this same time window, Jeffrey Hodge was on duty. He was not an outsider lurking in the shadows. He was part of the institution meant to protect students like Melissa. According to the conclusions reached by investigators, Hodge used the authority of his position to approach Melissa. A campus police officer asking questions or offering assistance would not have triggered suspicion. That authority allowed him to control the interaction, to limit her ability to resist, and to move her away from public areas without raising immediate alarm. The crime, as reconstructed by prosecutors, was not impulsive. Melissa was restrained with handcuffs, standard police equipment, effectively removing her capacity to flee or defend herself. She was taken away from populated areas of campus, into isolation. There, Hodge fired 14 shots, an overwhelming use of force that left no ambiguity about intent. The following day, January 15, 1992, Melissa Herstrom's body was discovered. The details were stark and devastating. She was still handcuffed. Investigators found no meaningful signs of defensive wounds, a detail that reinforced the conclusion that she had been restrained and controlled throughout the encounter. The scene itself raised immediate red flags. Handcuffs are not items commonly used in civilian crimes. They pointed directly toward law enforcement involvement. By mid-January 1992, the investigation narrowed with unusual speed. Ballistics and equipment analysis showed that the ammunition and restraints were consistent with police-issued gear. Witness accounts and patrol records placed Jeffrey Hodge as the last officer known to have contact with Melissa. Unlike many cases where suspects are identified through long chains of circumstantial evidence, this case collapsed inward. The threat was not hidden beyond the perimeter of the campus. It had been embedded within its security structure. By the end of January 1992, Jeffrey Hodge was arrested. The charges were severe and specific: aggravated murder, kidnapping, and abuse of power while on duty. The inclusion of abuse of authority reflected more than legal classification. It was an acknowledgement that the crime could not be separated from the role Hodge occupied. This was not merely a homicide. It was an act enabled by institutional trust. The trial in 1993 focused heavily on that breach. Prosecutors emphasized the physical evidence, the handcuffs, the number of shots fired, the controlled nature of the crime. 14 gunshots were not presented as excess alone, but as proof of deliberate intent. The courtroom narrative made clear that Melissa Hurstrom had been rendered powerless before the first shot was fired. Hodge did not deny pulling the trigger, but he failed to provide any explanation that justified or mitigated his actions. His silence on motive only deepened the perception of calculated violence. When the verdict was delivered in 1993, the court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was a definitive judgment, reflecting both the gravity of the crime and the circumstances under which it was committed. The sentence acknowledged that this was not a case in which rehabilitation or future release could reasonably be contemplated. From 1994 onward, Jeffrey Hodge entered the long, static phase of incarceration within the Ohio prison system. Over the years, appeals were filed, as is common in serious felony cases, but none succeeded in altering the outcome. No procedural failures were deemed sufficient to overturn the conviction. No new evidence emerged to soften the legal conclusions. The case settled into permanence. In 2021, nearly 3 decades after the crime, Hodge sought parole. The request was brief in its outcome, if not in its implications. The parole board denied the application, citing the exceptional severity of the offense and the profound abuse of police authority involved. The decision reinforced a principle central to the case. Some violations of trust are so complete that they permanently sever any claim to reintegration. As of 2025, Jeffrey Hodge remains incarcerated at Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio, serving a life sentence with no parole date scheduled. His case continues to be referenced in discussions about campus safety, police oversight, and the risks inherent when authority goes unchecked. Beyond the legal record, the story of Jeffrey Hodge forces an enduring question onto the public conscience. When protection becomes control, and control becomes violence, how many safeguards truly exist to stop it before it's too late? Richard DeGuglielmo, State, New York, 60 years old, released. Richard DeGuglielmo's story begins in a place that rarely attracts scrutiny until something goes wrong. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, he served as a police officer with the New York City Transit Police, a force tasked with maintaining order in one of the most complex public transportation systems in the world. In 1996, a confrontation outside a small family-owned store in New York changed everything. The incident did not begin as a violent crime, but as an argument over a parking space, one of the most ordinary and combustible disputes in an urban setting. What unfolded next would transform a routine disagreement into a fatal encounter. During the argument, Richard DeGuglielmo drew his firearm and shot Charles Campbell, a black man and the owner's relative, outside the store. Campbell died from his injuries. Almost immediately, the case ignited public attention, not simply because of the death itself, but because of who was involved. A police officer had killed a civilian. The civilian was black, and the justification offered, self-defense, fell into a legal and moral gray zone that New York had been struggling to define for years. From the earliest moments after the shooting, the narrative fractured. DeGuglielmo maintained that he feared for his life and acted to protect himself. Investigators, however, were faced with conflicting witness accounts. Some described Campbell as aggressive, others questioned whether the situation posed a lethal threat at all. The dispute raised uncomfortable questions about escalation. Was deadly force necessary, or had a trained officer allowed a minor conflict to spiral into a fatal outcome? These questions were not abstract. They shaped every stage of the investigation that followed. Later in 1996, after reviewing evidence and testimony, prosecutors charged Richard DeGuglielmo with second-degree murder. The decision to bring such a charge against a police officer underscored the seriousness with which the case was being treated. It also guaranteed that the trial would be closely watched, not just as a determination of guilt or innocence, but as a test of how the justice system handles violence committed by those sworn to uphold the law. The trial in 1997 unfolded against a backdrop of heightened racial tension and growing scrutiny of police use of force. Prosecutors argued that DeGuglielmo's actions went far beyond the boundaries of lawful self-defense. They emphasized the nature of the argument, the lack of a clear and immediate lethal threat, and the responsibility of an officer to de-escalate rather than inflame a confrontation. To the prosecution, this was not a split-second decision made under unavoidable danger, but a conscious choice to use deadly force in a situation that did not require it. When the verdict was delivered in 1997, the court convicted Richard DeGuglielmo and sentenced him to 20 years to life in prison. The decision reflected a conclusion that the shooting crossed the line from defense into criminal conduct. For supporters of the verdict, it was proof that police officers could be held accountable under the same laws as civilians. For critics, it raised concerns about whether DeGuglielmo had been judged not only for his actions, but for what he represented in a broader social conflict. From 1998 through the 2000s, DeGuglielmo served his sentence within the New York State prison system. During this time, he pursued multiple appeals, challenging both the legal interpretation of self-defense and aspects of the trial process. None succeeded in overturning the conviction. The case settled into a long period of relative quiet, resurfacing periodically in legal discussions about self-defense standards and police conduct, but largely absent from public attention. That changed again in 2018, when the New York Parole Board approved DeGuglielmo for release. The decision reignited controversy. To some, parole reflected the system functioning as designed, allowing for review after decades of incarceration. To others, it felt like a reopening of unresolved wounds, particularly given the racial dynamics of the original case and the ongoing national debate over police violence. On January 7, 2019, Richard DeGuglielmo was released from custody. As of 2025, DeGuglielmo remains free, his sentence completed under the terms of parole. Yet the case has never truly faded. It continues to be cited in discussions about where self-defense ends and criminal liability begins, especially when the person pulling the trigger is a trained officer. It also remains part of the broader conversation about race, authority, and accountability in the American justice system. At its core, the case of Richard DeGuglielmo leaves a lingering question that resists easy answers. When an officer claims fear, who decides whether that fear justifies a death? And how much trust should society place in that judgment? Joseph Kent McGowan, State, Texas, 60 years old, sentenced to life. Joseph Kent McGowan built his adult identity inside the structure of law enforcement, a place where authority is reinforced daily by uniform, procedure, and institutional loyalty. Everything began to fracture in early 1992. Susan White, a woman living in Harris County, accused him of harassment and intimidation. The complaint moved through internal channels, the very mechanisms designed to protect both officers and civilians. On paper, it was just another allegation awaiting review. In reality, the complaint threatened not only the job of McGowan, but the authority that defined him. According to investigators, the filing of that complaint triggered anger, fear, and a growing sense of vulnerability. The balance of power between officer and civilian shifted, and the relationship between McGowan and Susan White became increasingly tense. Later in 1992, Susan White was shot and killed. The date itself has never been widely publicized, but the outcome was immediate and irreversible. Joseph Kent McGowan was the man who pulled the trigger. In the moments that followed, he did what his training had prepared him to do, not to preserve life, but to control the narrative. Investigators later concluded that McGowan staged the scene to resemble a case of lawful self-defense. His initial report described Susan White as a threat, framing the shooting as a necessary response to danger. On its face, the account fit a familiar pattern: an officer confronted with a hostile individual, forced to act quickly. For a time, that version held. From 1992 onward, the case lingered in a gray zone of unresolved suspicion. As investigators revisited the evidence, inconsistencies began to surface. Physical findings at the scene did not fully align with McGowan's account. More troubling was the timeline: the documented complaint Susan White had filed months earlier. What initially appeared to be an isolated shooting began to look like retaliation. Over the years, the case underwent internal reviews and renewed scrutiny, each pass revealing more friction between McGowan's statements and the facts. Public pressure grew as the idea took hold that a woman who had dared to accuse a police officer ended up dead, and that the system had hesitated to confront that possibility. By 2002, the accumulated evidence and scrutiny reached a tipping point. Prosecutors formally charged Joseph Kent McGowan with murder. Their theory was direct and unsettling: the shooting was not self-defense, but revenge. According to the state, McGowan acted to silence a complainant and protect his career, exploiting his training and authority to disguise the act as justified force. The trial forced jurors to confront a deeply uncomfortable scenario: not a split-second mistake, but a calculated abuse of power rooted in fear of accountability. When the verdict was delivered in 2002, McGowan was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. It was not a life sentence, but it carried symbolic weight. The court acknowledged the severity of the crime while operating within Texas sentencing law, which allowed for parole eligibility after a portion of the sentence was served. For some observers, the sentence felt restrained given the circumstances. For others, it represented a rare moment in which a law enforcement officer was held criminally responsible for killing a civilian who had challenged him. McGowan entered the Texas prison system in 2003. Unlike cases that dominate headlines through endless appeals, his incarceration unfolded quietly. By approximately 2007, he became eligible for parole under state guidelines. What happened next remains largely opaque. Public records do not clearly indicate whether parole was granted, denied, or delayed. There are no widely reported hearings, no confirmed release dates, no definitive statements about his current custodial status. By 2025, McGowan may have completed his sentence, or may have been released earlier under parole supervision. The lack of transparency itself has become part of the story. At its core, this is not just a story about a single officer or a single victim. It is a warning embedded in the mechanics of power. When authority is challenged from below, and the challenge is routed back through the same hierarchy that granted that authority in the first place, the consequences can be fatal. The unanswered questions surrounding McGowan's current status only deepen the unease. If justice is meant to deter abuse, what message is sent when the final chapter remains hidden? And how many others have chosen silence over survival after seeing what happened when Susan White spoke up? Paul Duraso, State, Florida, 55 years old, sentenced to life. Paul Duraso's path into violence did not begin in chaos or marginalization, but inside one of the most disciplined institutions in American society. In the early to mid-1990s, he served in the United States Army as a military police officer, a role built around authority, control, and enforcement. The first killing attributed to Duraso occurred in 1997 in Georgia. The victim was a young woman, targeted not at random, but because she was vulnerable. Investigators later concluded that the attack involved sexual assault, followed by strangulation, a method that requires prolonged physical control and close contact. At the time, the crime was treated as an isolated homicide, tragic but unexceptional in a system flooded with similar cases. No connection was made to Duraso, and no pattern was identified. Over the next 6 years, from 1997 to 2003, the violence continued. At least 7 women were killed across Georgia and Florida, though investigators believe the true number may never be fully known. The victims shared critical similarities. They lived on the margins, lacked consistent protection, and were easy to overlook once they disappeared. At least 2 of the women were pregnant, a fact that later weighed heavily in court as an aggravating factor. For years, law enforcement chased fragments instead of a whole. Each homicide was boxed into its own file, its own timeline, its own local limitations. The absence of early linkage allowed Duraso to move freely, operating across state lines without raising alarms. This is where his background mattered most. He understood investigative blind spots. He knew how cases stalled, how evidence degraded, how interagency coordination failed. What looked like luck was, in reality, structural advantage. That advantage collapsed in early 2003. Duraso was arrested in Florida in connection with a specific murder, one that finally produced the forensic leverage investigators needed. DNA evidence tied him directly to the crime. Once his genetic profile entered national databases, past cases began to align. Patterns that had once been dismissed as coincidence now formed a clear trajectory. State and federal agencies coordinated, re-examining unsolved murders through a new lens. By mid-2003, Paul Duraso was officially identified as a serial killer responsible for a string of murders stretching back to 1997. Later that year, Duraso stood trial in Florida. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. DNA evidence anchored him to multiple crime scenes. Forensic experts testified about the consistent methods used across the killings. Prosecutors emphasized the escalation, the number of victims, the sexual violence involved, and the pregnancies that amplified the harm beyond individual lives. This was not framed as a momentary lapse or a crime of passion. It was presented as sustained, deliberate predation. In 2003, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, and Duraso was sentenced to death. The ruling appeared definitive. The state had identified, prosecuted, and condemned a serial murderer. For the families of the victims, the sentence promised finality. For the justice system, it marked closure. But the case was not finished. From 2004 through the mid-2010s, Duraso lived on Florida's death row, filing appeal after appeal. These challenges did not center on innocence. Instead, they focused on procedure, specifically, the way Florida juries weighed aggravating factors in capital sentencing. While many of his appeals were rejected, the legal ground beneath death penalty cases in Florida was shifting. In 2017, those questions reached Duraso's case. The Florida Supreme Court vacated his death sentence, ruling that the original jury process did not meet updated constitutional standards. The decision was procedural, not moral. It did not dispute the evidence or the verdict. It simply acknowledged that the process used to impose death no longer met legal requirements. Duraso was removed from death row and scheduled for resentencing. That resentencing occurred in 2021. This time, the outcome was permanent in a different way. Paul Duraso was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The death penalty was removed from the equation entirely. For some, the change represented a system correcting itself. For others, it felt like a dilution of justice, an administrative revision that did nothing to restore what had been taken. As of 2025, Paul Duraceau remains incarcerated in the Florida prison system, serving life without parole. He will never be released. At its core, the Duraceau case forces a confrontation with uncomfortable realities. Training does not guarantee restraint. Authority does not prevent predation. And justice, even when delivered, is rarely final in the way victims' families are promised. The question that lingers is not only how Duraceau was stopped, but how many years he was able to operate before the system learned to see him, and how many warning signs were never recognized until it was far too late. These cases do not end neatly with convictions or sentences. They leave behind questions about accountability, oversight, and how easily authority can be weaponized when warning signs are ignored. From death row to parole boards, each outcome reflects both punishment and systemic failure. As the stories fade from headlines, their implications remain. Do you believe these outcomes represent justice, or proof that the system still protects its own? Joseph Carl Shaw, State, South Carolina, 29 years old, execution date January 11, 1985. Joseph Carl Shaw was born in the United States, with much of his early life left largely undocumented in public records. Shaw eventually joined the U.S. military and served as a military police officer. On the night of October 24, 1977, Shaw, alongside James Terry Roach, abducted two teenagers, Thomas Taylor, just 17, and Carlotta Hartness, only 14. Both were minors, physically and legally unable to protect themselves from adult men exerting total control. The pair were taken to a remote, rural area of South Carolina, an intentional choice, prosecutors would argue, designed to eliminate witnesses and delay discovery. The teenagers were attacked and then shot. Their lives ended not in a moment of chaos, but through deliberate action. Their bodies were left outdoors, abandoned in darkness, as Shaw and Roach drove away, leaving behind a crime scene that spoke of power asserted without resistance. The shock of the murders spread quickly through the community, but the investigation moved with uncommon speed. Physical evidence recovered at the scene, combined with witness statements and subsequent questioning, led authorities directly to Shaw and Roach. By the end of 1977, both men were in custody. What emerged during interrogation would shape the narrative of the case for decades. Shaw admitted his central role in the killings, while Roach described Shaw as the dominant figure, the one who controlled the situation, made the decisions, and ultimately pulled the trigger. Investigators noted the dynamic between the two men. Roach appeared impulsive and emotionally volatile, while Shaw projected composure, authority, and command. That distinction would later become crucial in court. The trial process in 1978 and 1979 was swift but unforgiving. Prosecutors charged both men with aggravated murder, emphasizing not only the brutality of the crime, but the vulnerability of the victims. The jury heard how Shaw's military background translated into leadership during the offense, framing him not as a follower swept up in violence, but as the architect of it. Testimony and evidence consistently pointed to Shaw as the primary shooter, the individual who exercised control when the final decisions were made. When the verdicts were read in 1979, the outcome was absolute. Joseph Carl Shaw was sentenced to death. James Terry Roach received the same punishment. For the families of Thomas Taylor and Carlotta Hartness, the sentences offered a form of closure, though one permanently shadowed by loss. Shaw's years on death row stretched from 1979 to 1985, a period marked by legal appeals and psychological scrutiny. Defense attorneys argued that Shaw had the capacity for rehabilitation, pointing to expressions of remorse and attempts at religious reflection. Others raised questions about the influence Roach may have exerted, suggesting shared culpability rather than sole responsibility. Courts reviewed these claims carefully, but consistently rejected them. Judges emphasized the original findings, Shaw's leadership role, his direct actions, and the irreversible nature of what he had done. Each appeal failed, reinforcing the conclusion that the death sentence stood not as vengeance, but as the lawful consequence of calculated murder. By January 11, 1985, the legal process had reached its end. Joseph Carl Shaw was executed by electric chair, becoming the first person put to death in South Carolina after the state reinstated capital punishment. The execution carried symbolic weight beyond the individual case, signaling a renewed era of enforcement for the ultimate penalty. In the final minutes before the current was applied, Shaw issued a public apology. He accepted responsibility for his actions and expressed remorse for the pain inflicted on the victims' families. The timing of those words, spoken only moments before death, divided public opinion. Some viewed them as sincere acknowledgement. Others saw them as tragically insufficient, arriving far too late to matter. The legacy of Joseph Carl Shaw's case continues to resonate within true crime discussions and legal scholarship. It forces an uncomfortable examination of how authority, training, and unchecked control can coexist with profound moral failure. Does remorse at the end alter the meaning of a life defined by violence? And when a person trained to uphold the law becomes its most severe violator, is the punishment a reflection of justice served, or of a system confronting its own blind spots? Robert Leroy Nelson, State, Texas, 82 years old, sentenced to life. Robert Leroy Nelson was born in the United States. With much of his early personal history absent from public records, Nelson chose a career that placed him squarely within the machinery of law enforcement. On June 25, 1980, that trust became a weapon. While on active patrol, Nelson encountered Michelle Y. Busha, an 18-year-old hitchhiker. She belonged to one of the most vulnerable groups on American roads. Young travelers relying on strangers, visibility, and hope rather than protection. When Nelson stopped, he did not appear as a threat. He appeared as law enforcement. Prosecutors would later emphasize that this moment, this misuse of legitimate authority, was the turning point that sealed Michelle's fate. By invoking his role as a trooper, Nelson controlled the interaction from the outset. There was no struggle for dominance, no immediate alarm. Compliance was coerced by the badge itself. Then Michelle was abducted and held against her will. During her captivity, Nelson subjected her to prolonged physical torture, including the deliberate removal of her fingernails, an act investigators described as calculated and sadistic rather than impulsive. The violence escalated until it reached its final conclusion: Nelson murdered her. Her body was later discarded in a remote area, hidden by distance rather than ingenuity, left to decompose far from immediate discovery. The most disturbing element was not only the brutality of the act, but the context in which it occurred. Nelson was not off duty. He was working. The crime unfolded under the umbrella of lawful authority, transforming routine patrol into a private hunting ground. When Michelle's body was eventually found, the case stalled almost immediately. Although investigators suspected foul play, her identity could not be conclusively established at the time. Without a name, without a clear timeline, and without witnesses, the case drifted into the growing archive of unsolved murders. From 1980 through 1987, the investigation remained largely dormant. During those years, additional reports of missing persons surfaced along the same routes Nelson routinely patrolled. The pattern raised quiet suspicions among some investigators, but suspicion alone was not enough. Nelson continued his life, shielded by the same uniform that had enabled the crime. The silence of the case became part of its tragedy. The break came in 1988, During a broader review of unresolved cases, advances in investigative methods, and renewed scrutiny of law enforcement conduct reopened old files. Nelson was re-examined not as a protector, but as a potential suspect. Under renewed questioning and mounting pressure, the story unraveled. Nelson confessed to the killing of Michelle Busha. His admission confirmed what evidence alone had not been able to prove for 8 years. The murder had been committed by a state trooper acting under color of law. He was charged with kidnapping, torture, and murder, crimes that stripped away any remaining presumption of authority or legitimacy. Later that same year, Nelson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court's decision was unequivocal. There would be no chance for release, no future reintegration into society. For the state, the sentence represented a definitive rejection of the abuse of power that defined the crime. For the victim's family, however, the outcome remained incomplete. Michelle's identity, though known through confession, had not yet been scientifically confirmed. The case, while legally resolved, remained emotionally unresolved. From 1988 through 2014, Nelson remained incarcerated as investigators and journalists continued to revisit the implications of his actions. Questions lingered about whether Michelle was his only victim. Given his access to highways, his familiarity with vulnerable populations, and the absence of surveillance in rural patrol zones, some believed the confirmed murder represented only a fragment of a larger pattern. No additional charges were filed. The evidence, once again, was insufficient. The uncertainty became part of the case's legacy. In 2015, modern DNA technology finally closed the remaining gap. Forensic testing conclusively identified the remains as Michelle Y. Busha, confirming what had been known informally for decades. After 35 years, her family received scientific proof of her fate. The case was officially closed from both a legal and forensic standpoint. The resolution came long after Nelson had been removed from society, underscoring a harsh reality. Justice can be delayed even when the perpetrator is already behind bars. Marcus Eberhardt, State, Georgia, 51 years old, sentenced to life. Marcus Eberhardt was born in the United States. With little of his early life publicly documented, Eberhardt joined the East Point Police Department in Georgia and built a career that placed him inside a system designed to control volatile situations. On April 21, 2014, Eberhardt and fellow officer Howard Weems responded to an encounter involving Gregory Lewis Towns, Jr., a 24-year-old man. The situation escalated quickly, but not in the way police typically describe life-threatening confrontations. Towns was restrained and placed in handcuffs. According to later evidence, he no longer posed an immediate danger to officers or bystanders. That detail would become central to everything that followed. Over the next 6 minutes, Eberhardt and Weems repeatedly deployed their tasers against Towns's body. The devices, marketed and trained as less lethal alternatives to firearms, were used not once or twice, but a total of 47 times. The number itself shocked even seasoned investigators. By the end of the encounter, Towns collapsed, lost consciousness, and died either at the scene or shortly thereafter. Public reaction was swift and intense. The death of a handcuffed man, subjected to repeated electrical shocks, ignited outrage across Georgia and beyond. Protests erupted, and media coverage fixated on a single, disturbing contradiction. How could a weapon labeled non-lethal be used in a way that proved fatal? Initial police statements struggled to reconcile that contradiction, but the evidence spoke with clarity. Autopsy findings linked Towns's death directly to the cumulative effects of repeated electrical exposure, combined with physical restraint. Video footage and witness testimony reinforced the same conclusion. Towns was not fighting back when the tasers continued to fire. The incident was no longer framed as a tragic accident, but as a potential criminal act. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, attention increasingly focused on Eberhardt's role. As a supervising officer, he was not merely present, he carried command responsibility. Prosecutors argued that the repeated taser deployments were not the product of confusion or panic, but of decisions made and reinforced in real time. Each trigger pull extended the encounter, escalating the physiological stress on Towns's body. Medical experts testified that prolonged electrical shocks can disrupt heart rhythm, impair breathing, and overwhelm the body's ability to recover. In this case, restraint did not bring control. It became part of the mechanism of death. By 2015, the case reached a rare and consequential stage. Georgia prosecutors formally charged both Marcus Eberhardt and Howard Weems with felony murder and aggravated assault. Charging police officers for on-duty actions is uncommon. Charging them for murder is rarer still. The decision signaled that the state viewed the incident not as a failure of training alone, but as a violation of criminal law. The 2016 trial delivered a verdict that reverberated through law enforcement circles nationwide. Marcus Eberhardt was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Howard Weems received an 18-year sentence. The disparity reflected their different roles, with the court underscoring Eberhardt's responsibility as the ranking officer on scene. In sentencing, the judge emphasized that authority carries obligation, and that misuse of force, especially by those tasked with oversight, demands accountability. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was read, marking one of the most severe penalties ever imposed in Georgia for police use of excessive force. In the years that followed, the case became a reference point rather than a closed chapter. Law enforcement agencies across Georgia revisited their use of force policies, particularly surrounding tasers. Training programs were revised to stress not only when force is permitted, but when it must stop. Civil rights organizations cited the case as proof that less lethal does not mean harmless, and that repeated use can be deadly. Legal scholars pointed to the conviction as evidence that criminal liability can extend to officers who cross the line from control into punishment. Marcus Eberhardt's name is now inseparable from a broader reckoning over policing tools and accountability. If a man can die while handcuffed under the watch of trained officers, how many times can force be justified before it becomes something else entirely? David Middleton, State, Nevada, 64 years old, death row. David Middleton was born in the United States. Middleton entered law enforcement by joining the Miami Police Department in Florida. At some point, quietly, without public scandal, he exited policing and reinvented himself as a cable installation technician. The job came with a uniform, tools, and a legitimate reason to enter private homes. It also earned him a nickname investigators would later repeat with unease: the cable guy. By early to mid-1995, Middleton had begun using his new profession as a carefully constructed disguise. He could knock on doors without suspicion, move freely inside homes, and operate in enclosed spaces where no one could see or hear what happened next. Middleton selected victims who were alone, relied on the social contract of trust extended to service workers, and exploited the expectation that compliance was both safe and temporary. The violence escalated that same year in Reno, Nevada. Middleton abducted Catherine Powell, a 45-year-old woman, and subjected her to prolonged captivity. During that time, she was restrained, tortured, and ultimately killed. The crime was not impulsive. Prosecutors would later argue it unfolded in stages, each one reinforcing the next. Shortly after, Middleton struck again. His second victim, Thelma Davila, 36 years old, endured a nearly identical fate. The method was the same. The sequence was the same. The repetition made one thing unmistakable: this was a pattern, not an anomaly. The bodies of both women were eventually discovered in remote areas near Reno, discarded far from immediate detection. Understood how time, distance, and terrain could slow an investigation. What made the case particularly disturbing was not only the brutality, but the knowledge behind it. Middleton was not guessing how police would respond. He had once been part of that system. As a former officer, he understood investigative priorities, evidence handling, and the vulnerabilities of early-stage homicide cases. That insight allowed him to delay suspicion and complicate the search for answers. In the months following the discoveries, Reno police launched a large-scale investigation. Analysts began comparing timelines, entry methods, and victim profiles. The similarities were too precise to ignore. Soon, the focus shifted from individual crimes to the possibility of a serial offender operating across state lines. By late 1995, the scope of concern widened. Investigators identified unresolved disappearances in Colorado and Florida that shared troubling similarities with the Reno murders. Middleton's past employment and travel history placed him within reach of several of those cases. The theory was chilling but incomplete. While patterns raised suspicion, prosecutors lacked the physical evidence required to file additional charges. The possibility that more victims existed remained an open question, one that still lingers. What could be proven, however, was enough to move forward. Between 1996 and 1997, David Middleton was identified as the primary suspect in the Reno murders. He was arrested and extradited to face charges. Prosecutors filed counts, including 2 murders, kidnapping, and torture. Court documents described him as a systematic offender whose actions reflected planning, repetition, and escalation. This was not framed as a crime of passion or loss of control. It was presented as deliberate, methodical violence carried out by someone who understood how to minimize risk while maximizing control. The trial culminated in 1998. Inside the Nevada courtroom, jurors were confronted with evidence that detailed not only what Middleton did, but how long it lasted. Testimony emphasized the duration of captivity, the suffering inflicted, and the calculated nature of the acts. The jury ultimately concluded that the crimes met the threshold for the most severe punishment available under state law. Middleton was convicted and sentenced to death for the 2 murders. He was transferred to death row, joining a population reserved for offenders whose crimes were deemed irredeemable in severity. What followed was not closure, but time, decades of it. From 1998 through 2025, Middleton remained on death row, filing multiple appeals challenging procedural rulings and evidentiary decisions. Each was reviewed. Each was denied. By 2025, Middleton was still alive, still incarcerated, still waiting. The passage of time did not soften the facts of the case. Instead, it amplified the unsettling irony at its core. How many warning signs were missed before the first door opened? And when a former officer can hide behind ordinary work for decades, how many others never realize the danger until trust itself becomes the trap? Guarionex Candelario Rivera, State, Puerto Rico, 50 years old. Guarionex Candelario Rivera was born in Puerto Rico, with few publicly documented details about his early life. Rivera chose a career in law enforcement and joined the Puerto Rico Police Department. On August 10, 2015, Rivera arrived at the police station in Ponce while off duty. He was not responding to an emergency call, nor was he summoned by command. He came on his own, carrying a personal firearm. What began as a confrontation with fellow officers quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. According to investigators, a heated argument erupted inside the station, fueled by unresolved internal tensions. Words gave way to action. Rivera drew his weapon and opened fire inside the police facility itself. an act that shattered every assumption about safety within law enforcement spaces. The victims were not civilians caught in the wrong place, but Rivera's own colleagues. Commander Frank Roman Rodriguez was shot and killed. Lieutenant Luzem Soto Segarra was also fatally wounded. Agent Rosario Hernández de Hoyos became the third officer to lose his life. The scene was unprecedented in its brutality, a police station transformed into a crime scene, authority collapsing inward. The shock was immediate and visceral. An armed officer killing fellow officers inside headquarters was not just a crime, it was a symbolic rupture, exposing vulnerabilities few were prepared to acknowledge. As the situation unfolded, Rivera did not immediately surrender. During the chaos, he took hostages inside the station, escalating the incident into a full-scale internal security crisis. The building was locked down as specialized units were deployed to contain the threat. Negotiators worked to prevent further loss of life, balancing urgency with caution. Every minute stretched the tension, as officers faced the unthinkable reality that one of their own had become the central danger. Unlike street confrontations, this crisis carried a unique psychological weight, familiarity mixed with fear. Trust replaced by uncertainty. Eventually, the standoff ended without Rivera being killed at the scene. He was subdued and taken into custody alive. The station was sealed off. Evidence teams moved in, and the investigation began immediately. What had unfolded in minutes would take months to fully reconstruct. Ballistics, witness statements, internal communications, and psychological evaluations were all pulled into a case that demanded answers beyond the question of guilt. The public wanted to know how such an attack could happen inside a police station, and why warning signs, if they existed, had not stopped it. Between 2015 and 2016, prosecutors in Puerto Rico built a case that emphasized intent and accountability. Rivera was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, and weapons offenses. The charging documents described a deliberate act rather than a momentary loss of control. Investigators pointed to evidence of long-standing workplace conflicts and unresolved grievances. Mental health factors were acknowledged during proceedings, but prosecutors were clear. Psychological strain did not excuse calculated violence. Rivera, they argued, knew exactly where he was, who he was targeting, and what he was doing. The trial that followed forced the court to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional pressure and personal responsibility. Testimony detailed the sequence of events, the confined environment, and the lethal efficiency of the attack. Survivors and family members of the victims described the permanent damage left behind, not only the loss of life, but the erosion of safety within a space once considered secure. When sentencing arrived in 2016, the court delivered one of the harshest outcomes possible. Rivera was sentenced to more than 200 years in prison, a term effectively equivalent to life without parole. There would be no path back into society, no possibility of release. The aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. Within the Puerto Rico Police Department, the case triggered widespread reviews of station security, access control, and internal threat assessment. Policies were re-examined to address how officers in emotional or psychological distress were monitored and supported. Mental health evaluations became a focal point, not as a shield against accountability, but as a preventative measure. The goal shifted toward identifying crises before they turned violent. The case leaves behind a haunting question that continues to resonate in law enforcement agencies worldwide. When the threat comes from inside the badge itself, who is responsible for seeing it coming? And how many lives depend on that answer? Eric Glenn Banks, Jarrah State, Maryland, 37 years old. Eric Glenn Banks Judah was born in the United States, with limited public information about his early years. Banks chose a career in law enforcement and joined the Baltimore Police Department. The internal records examined later would paint a more complicated picture. Behind the professional role, investigators would identify patterns of personal instability and unresolved family conflict. As time went on, those personal pressures intensified. The home environment became strained, then combustible. According to later findings, warning signs surfaced: conflict, instability, escalating tension. But no effective intervention followed. Whether through missed opportunities or systemic hesitation, the signals were not treated as urgent threats. The presence of a firearm in this environment would later become impossible to ignore. In 2021, that tension reached a point of no return. Banks arrived at the residence where his stepson, Dason DJ Jones, lived. DJ was 15 years old, still a minor, still dependent, still defenseless against adult force. Inside that home, a confrontation escalated into domestic violence. At some point during the altercation, Banks fired a gun. The shot struck DJ, killing him. There was no chase, no street encounter, no ambiguity about threat levels. The victim was a child, shot inside what should have been a place of safety. The shock of the case was immediate and visceral. A police officer had killed his own stepson. When Baltimore police officers arrived at the scene, the danger was not yet over. Banks did not comply with commands. Instead, he resisted, escalating the situation further. In a moment that stunned even seasoned responders, Banks attempted to disarm one of the officers on scene. The risk multiplied instantly. A domestic homicide had become an active officer safety crisis. Backup units moved quickly, and Banks was eventually subdued without additional loss of life. But the implications were clear. This was not only a murder, it was a collapse of control by someone trained to maintain it. Banks was taken into custody and formally charged later in 2021. Prosecutors filed counts, including second-degree murder and attempted disarming of a police officer. The case was categorized as a severe instance of domestic violence involving a member of law enforcement, placing it under intense public and legal scrutiny. The courtroom narrative focused not only on the fatal act, but on the decisions that followed: the resistance, the attempted weapon grab, and the heightened risk to responding officers. The fact that Banks himself had been trained in use of force protocols only deepened the gravity of the charges. In 2022, the case took a decisive turn. Banks entered an Alford plea, a legal mechanism allowing a defendant to maintain innocence, while acknowledging that the prosecution's evidence would likely result in conviction at trial. He did not admit to murdering DJ, but he accepted the legal reality of the case against him. The court accepted the plea, closing the door on a jury trial while preserving the weight of the evidence. For many observers, the plea underscored a familiar tension in the justice system: legal resolution without emotional clarity. From 2022 through 2025, Banks remained incarcerated while awaiting sentencing. During this period, the court reviewed extensive material: the age of the victim, the domestic setting, the use of a firearm, and the attempted disarming of police officers. Each factor compounded the severity of the case. DJ's age was impossible to overlook. He was not a bystander or an accidental victim. He was a child caught in an adult's collapse. Prosecutors emphasized that the danger did not end with the shooting, highlighting Banks's actions toward responding officers as evidence of continued volatility. In 2025, sentencing brought a measure of finality. The court imposed a 42-year prison term. Given Banks's age, the sentence was widely viewed as a de facto life sentence. There would be no realistic opportunity for early release, no return to public life. The ruling reflected not only punishment, but condemnation of the violence, of the abuse of authority, and of the systemic failures that allowed warning signs to go unaddressed.